James had always been invisible. From the moment he walked into the towering glass building every morning, he was nothing more than a shadow among the busy, important people. To them, he was just the janitor, the man who cleaned their spills, polished the marble floors, and quietly emptied the trash bins. No one smiled at him in the hallways. No one asked how he was. They barely noticed he existed. But James didn't mind. He had learned long ago that the world didn't owe him attention. Instead, he found small joys in his work. The glint of sunlight reflecting on a freshly polished floor, the soft sound of water swishing in the mop bucket, the quiet satisfaction of a job done well. These tiny moments, simple and unnoticed, gave him peace. Despite his humility, James carried a quiet dream in his heart. He dreamed of a life where he mattered, where someone looked at him and saw more than a uniform and a mop. Sometimes, late at night when the hallways were empty, he imagined a world where people appreciated him, not for what he cleaned, but for who he was. It was a fragile dream, one he rarely allowed himself to speak aloud. He knew it might never come true, yet it warmed him in ways nothing else could. His life was predictable, almost monotonous, but that predictability brought comfort. He knew every crack in the floor, every hallway light that flickered, every office that smelled of stale coffee and perfume. The staff above, managers, assistants, executives, moved with urgency and importance, never stopping to notice him. And James never asked for recognition. He had long accepted that he was simply part of the background, part of the machinery that kept the building running. Yet sometimes he wondered if anyone would even notice if he vanished. One evening, as rain poured heavily outside, James finished his cleaning rounds. The storm had left the streets wet and glimmering, reflecting the golden lights of the city. He lingered near the CEO's office, the sound of rain tapping against the windows mixing with the soft hum of the air conditioning. That's when he saw him, Ethan Vance, the billionaire everyone admired, feared, and envied. Ethan was slumped over his desk, exhausted, his tie undone, his hands trembling slightly as he rubbed his temples. He looked human, fragile and utterly alone, a side of the man no one ever saw. James hesitated for a moment, unsure if he should approach. He had seen executives stressed before, but something about tonight felt different. There was a vulnerability in Ethan's posture, a heaviness in his breathing that tugged at James's heart. He felt an unusual stir of concern, a mix of curiosity and compassion that urged him closer. Yet he remained cautious, knowing his place. He was, after all, invisible. No one would expect him to act. No one would notice if he simply turned away. But fate has a way of choosing the smallest, most overlooked people for the biggest moments. James was about to discover that the quiet life he had accepted for so long was about to be shattered. In the next few minutes, everything he knew about his world and himself would change. One stormy night, one lonely billionaire, and one janitor who had spent a lifetime in the shadows were about to collide in a way that neither of them could have imagined. As James watched Ethan struggle in silence, he felt a strange tightening in his chest. Something deep inside whispered that this night would not end like any other. He had no idea what role he would play, or how drastically his life would shift in mere moments. But for the first time in years, James felt a pulse of something he had almost forgotten. The possibility of importance, the chance to matter, and the quiet hope that even someone like him could change a life. And perhaps his own destiny. The rain poured relentlessly outside, drumming on the tall glass windows of the skyscraper. The city lights reflected off the wet streets, creating a world of golden shimmer and shadows. Inside, James moved quietly through the hallways, his mop squeaking softly across the polished floors. He had finished most of his rounds, but something pulled him toward the CEO's office tonight. He couldn't explain why, only that a strange feeling tugged at his chest, a mixture of worry and instinct. As he neared the corner, he saw him again, Ethan Vance. The billionaire was slumped in his chair, shoulders shaking slightly, his hands trembling as he rubbed his temples. His usually perfect posture was gone, replaced with exhaustion and something James had never seen before: fear. Ethan's usually sharp eyes were dull, clouded with confusion and pain. For a moment James froze, unsure if he should enter. He had no right. He was just a janitor. He had no place in a world of boardrooms and billion-dollar decisions. But then he noticed Ethan's sudden lurch forward, and in that instant, everything changed. Ethan's chair tipped too far back, and before James could react, he collapsed onto the marble floor with a heavy thud. The sound echoed through the empty office, mingling with the storm outside. James's heart stopped. Panic surged through him as he rushed forward, slipping slightly on the wet floor. "Sir, are you okay?" he shouted, though he knew it was unlikely that Ethan could respond. Ethan's body was limp, his breath shallow and uneven. James quickly checked his pulse, relief and fear colliding. He was alive, but barely. James's mind raced. He had taken a first aid course once years ago, and suddenly every lesson came rushing back. He remembered the words: "If someone is not breathing, you must act immediately." Without thinking, James knelt beside Ethan. He shook him gently, trying to get a reaction. "Sir, please wake up." His voice trembled with urgency. The room felt impossibly silent, the storm outside distant compared to the pounding in his own chest. Then James did something he had never imagined he would do, something impulsive, desperate, and human. He leaned over Ethan and pressed his lips to his, performing a desperate kiss to revive him, to give him life. The gesture was born of fear, instinct, and hope. James held his breath, praying silently, hoping against hope that it would work. The seconds stretched like hours. Each heartbeat felt deafening, each moment unbearable. Then, as if a miracle had passed through the stormy night, Ethan gasped. His eyes fluttered open, wide with shock and confusion. He coughed, trying to catch his breath, and blinked rapidly as he tried to understand what had just happened. "What?" he stammered, voice weak, trembling with disbelief. James sat back on his heels, chest heaving, unable to speak. His hand still trembled. He had crossed a line he had never imagined crossing, yet the urgency of the moment had left him no choice. I didn't know what else to do," he finally whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain. You weren't breathing." Ethan stared at him, a mixture of shock, gratitude, and something else he could not name. He had been in countless dangerous situations, faced threats that would make most men panic. But nothing in his life had left him feeling this raw, this human, this completely vulnerable. And yet he was alive, because of a janitor, a man no one had ever noticed, who had acted when the world would have just watched. James's heart raced as he helped Ethan sit upright, holding him gently to make sure he didn't collapse again. The room was still drenched in the golden glow of city lights, but now it felt warmer, almost sacred. In that quiet moment, between the storm outside and the stillness inside, a bond had formed, a bond forged not by wealth or power, but by humanity, courage, and the sheer act of caring when it mattered most. For James, it was a moment he would never forget. For Ethan, it was a night that would change his understanding of life, vulnerability, and the people he had always overlooked. Neither of them knew it yet, but this stormy night would mark the beginning of something neither of them could have imagined, something that would forever alter the paths of their lives. Ethan's eyes fluttered open, heavy and disoriented. For a moment he didn't know where he was or what had happened. The office looked strange, too quiet, too still, except for the gentle hum of the lights and the soft patter of rain against the windows. Then his gaze fell on James, the janitor, kneeling beside him with wide, worried eyes. Ethan's lips parted in shock. You saved me?" he whispered, his voice shaking as if even speaking might shatter the fragile moment. James nodded, unable to find the right words. His own heart was still racing, chest tight with the adrenaline of the crisis. I didn't know what else to do," he admitted softly. "You weren't breathing, and I thought maybe this would help." His voice trembled, filled with a quiet honesty that surprised even him. He had acted out of instinct, out of compassion, and now he realized that instinct had changed everything. Ethan struggled to sit upright, gripping the edge of the desk for support. He felt a strange weakness in his body, but a stronger, more startling feeling in his chest, a mix of gratitude, awe, and disbelief. He had faced crises before, emergencies that required careful decisions and calculated risks, but nothing in his entire life had felt as raw, as human as this moment. And the person who had saved him wasn't a trained doctor or a bodyguard. It was James, the man he had barely noticed before, the janitor who moved quietly through his building without anyone giving him a second thought. For James, seeing Ethan awake was surreal, the world he had observed from the shadows. The world of wealth, power, and endless ambition suddenly felt closer yet strangely distant. He had always believed his life was small, insignificant, but tonight he had proven himself wrong. He had acted when it mattered most. He had saved a life, and in that act he discovered a strength he never knew he had, a courage that wasn't measured by money or status, but by the willingness to care when no one else would. Ethan reached out, his hand shaking as it touched James's arm. I can't believe you did that," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't hesitate. You didn't think about yourself, you just saved me." His eyes glistened with unshed tears, a rare vulnerability for a man who had spent his life behind walls of power and perfection. For the first time he felt completely human, fragile, alive, and deeply grateful. James looked at him, heart pounding, unsure of what to say. Words felt inadequate, incapable of expressing the mixture of fear, relief, and awe that still surged through him. He simply nodded, his eyes meeting Ethan's, and in that silent connection they both understood something profound. This was not just a life saved. It was a bridge between two worlds, two people who had never truly seen each other until now. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the office, there was a quiet calm, a fragile serenity. Ethan leaned back slowly, still trembling, and James stayed close, ready to support him if he faltered again. In that moment they were equals, not by wealth, status, or power, but by something far more important: shared humanity, trust, and the recognition that even the smallest actions could carry the weight of life itself. Ethan's voice broke the silence. You're not just a janitor, are you?" he said, half in awe, half in wonder. James shook his head with a shy smile. "I've always been just me," he said softly. "But tonight, I guess I was more than that." And in those words something shifted between them. The invisible man had become indispensable. The billionaire had been reminded that life could be fragile, unpredictable, and beautiful in ways he had never imagined. That night a bond was formed, born of fear, courage, and an act of pure, selfless humanity. Neither of them knew how it would shape the future, but one thing was certain: everything had changed, and nothing would ever be the same again. The morning sun filtered through the tall glass windows, casting a warm glow across the CEO's office. James stood quietly near the door, mop in hand, but this time it felt different. The building that had always seemed so distant and intimidating now carried a sense of possibility he hadn't felt before. He had saved Ethan's life, and the memory of that night, the storm, the fear, the desperate act that had worked, still pulsed in his chest like a living heartbeat. Ethan was seated at his desk, a cup of coffee in hand, though he barely touched it. He had not slept well. The image of James kneeling beside him, the worry and courage in his eyes, had haunted him. He replayed every second, every heartbeat, and a strange realization settled in his mind. James was more than he seemed. More than a janitor, more than someone easily overlooked. He had shown bravery, empathy, and a presence of mind that few in the world could match. "James," Ethan said, his voice calm but weighted with something deeper. Something that carried gratitude and curiosity at the same time. James turned, startled that the billionaire was speaking directly to him, not just in passing but with genuine attention. "Come in," Ethan added. "I want to talk to you, properly." James hesitated. This wasn't how the world usually worked. Janitors didn't get invitations from billionaires to have real conversations. He nodded slowly and stepped forward. The office felt enormous, but for the first time he didn't feel small. He felt seen. Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying James carefully. "You saved my life last night," he said simply, though the weight of the words hung heavy in the air. "And I can't stop thinking about it. You didn't hesitate. You acted when no one else would have. You didn't think about yourself, just me." His eyes softened. "I don't know how to thank you properly." James looked down, uncertain. Praise was not something he was used to, and he felt awkward under Ethan's gaze. I just did what I had to," he said quietly. "Anyone would have done the same, I guess." But even as he spoke, he knew the words were only partly true. He had acted because he cared, because something inside him refused to stand by while another human being, no matter how rich or famous, was in danger. Ethan smiled faintly, leaning forward. "No," he said. "Not anyone. Not everyone would have. You risked everything, and you saved me. You changed everything." He paused, searching for words that felt inadequate. "I want you to know something, James. From now on, you are not invisible. Not to me. Not ever again." James's heart pounded. The walls he had built around himself, the quiet acceptance of invisibility, the small world he had carved out in shadows, began to crumble. For the first time, he felt a spark of something he had almost forgotten. Hope. The hope that his life could mean more than just routine, that he could make a difference beyond cleaning floors and emptying trash bins. Over the next few minutes, they spoke quietly, like two people bridging an enormous gap in a single conversation. Ethan shared stories of the pressures he carried, the loneliness that came with wealth, and the moments when even his success couldn't shield him from fear or despair. James listened, offering quiet wisdom, empathy, and understanding. He didn't speak in terms of money or power. He spoke in terms of humanity, courage, and heart. And Ethan realized that he had underestimated the people he often ignored. By the time their conversation ended, something fundamental had shifted. James was no longer just a janitor. To Ethan, he was a friend, a confidant, and someone whose presence mattered deeply. And James, in turn, understood that the world was bigger than he had imagined, but also that courage and kindness could give him a place in it. That morning marked a turning point. The storm of the previous night had passed, leaving behind not just the wet streets outside, but a quiet awakening inside both men, a recognition that true strength and connection often come from the most unexpected places. For James, it was the first glimpse of a life where he could matter. For Ethan, it was a reminder that even billionaires needed humanity, trust, and someone to truly see them. And in that shared understanding, a bond was quietly forged, one that would grow stronger with every moment that followed. Days passed since that fateful night, but nothing felt the same for James. He moved through the halls of the skyscraper with the same quiet steps, mop in hand, yet every glance felt different now. People still overlooked him, passing by without a second thought, but James no longer felt invisible. He carried a secret strength, a quiet pride that no title or uniform could ever take away. He had saved a life, and that life belonged to Ethan Vance, the most powerful man in the building, the man whose world had always seemed untouchable. Ethan, on the other hand, could not forget James. Every time he sat at his desk, he saw the janitor's worried eyes, the steady hands, and the courage that had saved him. The memory of James's kiss, the desperate, life-giving act, haunted him in the best possible way. It reminded him that life was fragile, that power and money could not shield him from vulnerability. And it reminded him of a truth he had long ignored. Some of the most extraordinary people are the ones no one notices. Unable to contain his gratitude, Ethan called James into his office one morning. "I want to do something for you," he said, his voice calm but firm. James looked at him, hesitant. He had no idea what Ethan could offer that mattered to him. Money? Recognition? James had never cared much for either. All he had wanted was to be seen, to feel that his life mattered. Yet Ethan's words carried weight beyond wealth. They carried respect. "I saved your life," James said softly, shrugging. "You don't owe me anything." Ethan shook his head. "It's not about owing," he said. "It's about acknowledging courage. You risked yourself when no one else would. That matters. That changes everything." He paused, studying James carefully. "I want you to be more than a janitor in this building. I want you to be someone I can trust, someone I can rely on. If you accept, you'll work with me, not as a cleaner, but as someone important to me, someone whose voice I value." James's heart pounded. He had never imagined such an offer. Never believed someone like Ethan would see him in this light. Part of him wanted to laugh in disbelief, to turn away and pretend it was a dream. But deep inside he felt the stirrings of hope, the sense that his life might finally stretch beyond the shadows he had walked in for so long. I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't need to say anything yet," Ethan replied. "Just know that I see you. That's enough for now." Over the following days, Ethan began involving James in small ways, asking his opinion on minor decisions, seeking his perspective on problems that required honesty rather than politics, trusting him with small but meaningful responsibilities. James was hesitant at first, unsure if he belonged, unsure if the billionaire's attention was real. But slowly he realized that Ethan valued him, not for his status, not for what he could do in a traditional sense, but for his courage, empathy, and honesty. Colleagues in the building started to notice subtle changes too. The way Ethan greeted James with respect, the way he listened when James spoke, even the smallest nod of acknowledgement. People who had never paid attention began to glance, wondering why the billionaire seemed to value the janitor more than ever. Yet James remained humble, never seeking recognition, content simply knowing that someone truly saw him for who he was. One evening, James stood by the office window, looking out at the city lights reflecting on wet streets, and thought about how much had changed in just a few days. He was still a janitor in title, but in heart and purpose, he had stepped into a new world, a world where courage, kindness, and humanity mattered more than any office or paycheck. And Ethan, watching him quietly from the doorway, realized something too. Life's greatest treasures were not found in wealth or power, but in the moments when ordinary people showed extraordinary courage. James had saved him, yes, but he had also reminded him what it meant to be human. In that quiet understanding, both men knew that their lives were no longer the same. The storm had passed, but the bond it had forged would last forever, guiding them through a world that suddenly seemed richer, warmer, and filled with possibility. Weeks had passed since that night, yet James still carried the memory of Ethan's collapse and the desperate act that had saved him. Every time he walked through the hallways of the skyscraper, he felt a quiet pride, a subtle shift in how he viewed himself. He had always been invisible, unnoticed, and underestimated, but now he realized that true courage wasn't about titles or money. It was about stepping up when it mattered most. Even when no one expected it, Ethan, meanwhile, could not stop thinking about James. He watched him in the hallways, admired the quiet determination in his eyes, and was struck by the humility that accompanied such immense bravery. Ethan had met countless people, advisors and assistants, friends and colleagues, but none had moved him the way James had. The janitor who had saved his life had taught him something he had long forgotten. Strength could come in the most unexpected forms. One afternoon, Ethan asked James to join him in his office, this time not for recognition or a task, but simply to talk. James hesitated, unsure what the billionaire could possibly want from him. But when he stepped inside, he realized this was different. Ethan was relaxed, leaning back in his chair, a small smile on his face that James rarely saw. It was an invitation, unspoken but clear. Share yourself if you wish. You know, Ethan began. I've had everything money can buy. Every luxury, every advantage, every comfort. But I've never had this. He gestured at James without a word, meaning the honesty, the courage, and the human connection they now shared. James felt a warmth in his chest, a quiet acknowledgement that what he had done had ripple effects far beyond that night. For the next hour, they talked. James listened as Ethan spoke about the loneliness of wealth, the pressures of leadership, and the constant feeling that no one truly saw him. He spoke openly, without pretense, revealing fears he had never shared with anyone. And James in turn offered his perspective, not as a rich man, not as a powerful executive, but as a human being who understood struggle, humility, and the value of life itself. You don't have to hide behind wealth or power with me, James said softly. I see you. I see everything, not just what the world wants to notice, and that's enough. Ethan paused, eyes glistening with emotion. It's strange, he said. I've had people around me for years, advisors, friends, colleagues, but never anyone who actually sees me. Until you. His voice was almost a whisper, full of awe and vulnerability. You've changed the way I look at everything. From that moment on, their bond deepened. Ethan began to rely on James, not just for advice or assistance, but for companionship and perspective. James was there for the long nights when Ethan wrestled with decisions that affected thousands, offering quiet support, sometimes just a listening ear, sometimes a small, insightful word that made all the difference. James, too, felt the shift in himself. He had always thought of his life as small, inconsequential. But now he realized that value wasn't determined by wealth, position, or recognition. It was measured by courage, kindness, and the ability to make a difference when it mattered most. And in this strange, unexpected friendship with Ethan Vance, he had found purpose, respect, and a sense of belonging he had never known. Together, they discovered a new rhythm, a balance of humility and strength, trust and understanding. They laughed at small jokes, shared quiet moments of reflection, and slowly, James became not just the janitor who saved a life, but a trusted presence in a world that had once ignored him completely. And Ethan? He learned that power and influence could never replace the simple truth of being truly seen. James had saved his life, yes, but he had also saved his heart, reminding him what it meant to be human, to trust, and to value the extraordinary courage that lives quietly in ordinary people. Months had passed since the stormy night that had altered everything. James still moved quietly through the halls, mop in hand, but the man he had once been, the invisible janitor, was gone. Now he carried with him a quiet confidence, a subtle glow that came from knowing he had saved a life and had earned the trust of someone extraordinary. He didn't need a title or recognition. What mattered was the bond he shared with Ethan, the billionaire who had once seemed untouchable but was now his friend, his confidant, and someone who truly saw him. Ethan's life, too, had changed. He had begun to see the world differently, noticing the courage in those he had once ignored, valuing humanity over status, and understanding that the smallest acts could hold the greatest weight. He had learned that life's true treasures weren't wealth, power, or luxury. They were trust, connection, and the people who would stand by you when no one else could. And James had shown him exactly that. One bright afternoon, Ethan called James to his office. There was a sparkle in his eyes, a warmth in his smile, and a seriousness that made James curious. "I've been thinking," Ethan said, leaning back in his chair, "about everything that's happened. About you, about me, about us." He paused, watching James carefully. "I want you to have a role in my life. Not just here in the building, but beyond this office, beyond these walls. You've earned it. You deserve it. And I want you to know you matter." James felt a lump in his throat. For a lifetime, he had moved through the world unnoticed, dismissed, invisible. And yet here was Ethan, a man whose life had touched countless others, telling him that he mattered. Words failed him. He simply nodded, overwhelmed by a mixture of pride, gratitude, and disbelief. Ethan continued, softer this time. almost shyly. "You've changed my life, James, that night. You didn't just save me, you reminded me what it means to be human. And I don't want to lose that. I don't want to ever forget it." His voice broke slightly, filled with emotion. James, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, felt tears prick at the corners of his own. "Sir," James began, but Ethan interrupted with a small, gentle smile. "Call me Ethan," he said. "Friends don't need titles." For the first time, James smiled freely without reserve. He had never felt this seen, this valued, this connected. He realized that life could be extraordinary even for someone like him. Courage, kindness, and humanity had carried him here, and now the world felt wide open. He wasn't just a janitor anymore. He was someone who had made a difference, whose presence could change lives, whose heart mattered. Weeks later, Ethan publicly acknowledged James, not with grandeur or a show, but quietly, in small ways that spoke volumes. He introduced James to colleagues as a trusted advisor, consulted him on matters both big and small, and treated him with the respect and friendship he deserved. People began to notice the bond between them, not as gossip, but as a lesson. Sometimes the most important people are those we least expect. One evening, as the sun set over the city, Ethan and James stood side by side, looking out at the golden streets below. Ethan raised a glass of champagne, a rare gesture of celebration. "To the janitor who saved me," he said, his voice filled with warmth. James chuckled softly, feeling the weight of the moment in the best possible way. "And to the billionaire who saw me," he replied, eyes meeting Ethan's with a mixture of humor and heartfelt sincerity. In that moment, they both understood something profound. Life had changed, not because of wealth or status, but because of courage, trust, and human connection. The storm had passed, leaving behind not just calm, but a lasting bond that neither money nor power could ever break. James had stepped from the shadows into a life filled with possibility, respect, and friendship. Ethan had learned to value the extraordinary in the ordinary. And together, they had discovered the true meaning of life. That the smallest acts of bravery and kindness can ripple far beyond expectation, changing hearts, saving lives, and leaving the world forever different. And in that quiet, golden light of evening, both men smiled, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again.